So before we get too deep into coronavirus and what we're going to do in response, just wanted to talk about design and maybe sort of come back to a couple of definitions. And I'm pretty biased, I'd say. I've been doing this, working in design consultancy in London, Dublin, and most of my career now, coming home and working in Belfast, for about 20 years, actually. So I see every challenge, every business challenge, every new project, every startup as an opportunity for design. So that might sound really blinkered, but I have yet to come upon a challenge where design thinking, we're adopting a human-centered approach to a problem, where collaborating with a diverse group of people and perspectives doesn't add value to a specific problem. And you'll note that I'm not really talking about a kind of a designing a website or making an app or creating a brochure. I'm talking about big challenges. The work that we do varies from working on kind of large technical software projects to designing culture, designing a kind of a team structure, working on systems thinking, applying systems thinking to sort of complex problems that might exist in the public sector. We just recently started working with a venture capital firm with offices in London, Geneva, and New York to design the future version of that business, and specifically how they interact with partners, with portfolio companies, with employees. So again, sort of applying design thinking to these kind of broad problems. So we sort of see design sitting between these two terms here, creativity and innovation. And these are terms that are often used sometimes interchangeably. We have conversations about design, can't really not talk about creativity. Creativity has a role, and innovation, well, what's that? And how's that different from design? So this is a useful definition from the Design Council in the UK, who talk about creativity as the generation of new ideas. So creativity is really like, think of imagination, or think of sort of what artists do, or any creative act is the sort of the creation of something new. And innovation is the successful exploitation of that creativity. And it's the process that carries that creativity all the way through into new products, new services, etc. Effectively, anything that is commercialized, that comes from a sort of a creative act, a sort of an observation of an opportunity, and that's innovation. And in this definition, the Design Council sees design as this interface between these two things. So design being a kind of a process that harnesses creativity and imagination, and is the means to this innovation end. So if you think about design in that way, you sort of zoom out from designing things, and you see a verb, not a noun. You see a process, not a thing. You see a set of methods and tools and a way of working, not an artifact or an object. So this is a slide from a great report, first reference. For those of you who don't want to go digging, the Design and Tech Report. It's published by a guy called John Maeda. John Maeda is currently head of inclusive design, I believe, at Publicis Sapient, head of customer experience. Actually, he was previously the design partner at a venture capital firm in Silicon Valley called Kleiner Perkins Caufield Byers, KPCB. Some of you might have heard. And what was happening a few years ago, we noticed, was in VC firms, so sort of the world of investment in Silicon Valley and New York, a lot of these VC firms started to hire designers. So you would see these kind of senior partners managing and running investment portfolios with professionally trained designers popping up on these investment panels. So why was that happening? It's happening because it's sort of a general feeling that as technology becomes more and more commoditized, and what I mean there, for any technologists who are offended by that statement that might be on the call, is it's never been easier to spin up an AWS instance. It's never been easier to get a URL to kind of, set up a little kind of Shopify e-commerce store. It's never been easier to, create a sort of a new commercial offering on the web or create technology. So there's a sort of a general macro trend where the friction is being removed from deploying technology in order to create value. And then against that backdrop, what you've got then is this rise of experience, where concepts like user experience, creating, trying to kind of manipulate, enhance, augment how the user feels about a specific interaction with an application, a product, a service, an online store, and customer experience, really sort of understanding the customer journey and how the customer interacts with a business at various different touch points on that journey. And then again, looking at that through a macro lens, it's like the lifetime value. So all of these things, I would argue, can be designed. And what that means is that you had sort of designers showing up as investment partners in VC firms, trying to identify the startups that they could invest in that have that potential, that really understand customer experience, that will really build, hugely successful global brands, not just highly competent technology companies. So that edge becoming this kind of, X factor, this notion of customer or user experience. So John Maeda published this report, 3-4 years in a row, called the Design and Tech Report, which really tracks the rise of design in global technology. And he says there's 3 kinds of design. There's classical design, which is fashion, design within the creative arts, anything that is concerned with look and feel or visual language. Then there's design thinking, which is the application of that quote unquote designer's toolkit to business problems. And then there is computational design. So computational design is really thinking about, okay, well, how do we apply design thinking and this methodology to a world where we're developing services for not hundreds of people or thousands of people, but billions of people? And how do the laws of computation, and indeed Moore's law, make us think differently about how we deliver an interface or a touch point to customers who are different sides of the planet? So computation is really the sort of biggest driver of change in design practice. And this is design thinking. I'm going to take a flyer here and assume that most of the people on the call here have come across design thinking, or kind of might have even sort of been on a course or kind of learned a little bit, or maybe practiced some of this. So design thinking is about 50 years old as a term now. Like every new thing, it's not new at all. It's a derivative of human-centered design or human-computer interaction, which is really kind of thinking about this, this sort of interface between, people and products and services systems. So the process of making products and services that addresses this kind of unmet need. So we start with really understanding our customer. We define a problem based on this insight that we've learned from our customer research. We'll then form a creative response to that specific problem. We'll decide which part of that or all of it that we should prototype quickly, and we'll kind of test our hypothesis. And a big motive we always kind of talk about, call this out. This is a sort of linear model that was developed by the founders of the Hasso-Plattner School of Design at Stanford, or the D School as it's known. And it looks linear, but actually the process in terms of the way that we apply it is cyclical. So if we think about then design thinking and sort of how that shows up in the world, this is a really great little model by a guy called Richard Buchanan, where you can think about this range of complex problems. So where there's low complexity, we can apply design to this sort of visual end. This is maybe the sort of classical design, where we're designing things like logos and signs and communication, and sort of things that are sort of concerned with kind of with the visual. as we move down here into kind of, products, tools, furniture, objects, and even software, and it becomes more complex. And now we're in the world of experience. We're actually now thinking about the human and how they interact with these products. As we move further along this complexity spectrum, you get into services, and services can be highly complex. You think about a restaurant and how we deliver the experience of a customer going to a restaurant. You've not only got to think about table service, you've got to think about environment, you've got to think about menu, you've got to think about ingredients, you've got to think about who's preparing the food, you've got to think about ambience, you've got to think about delivery, all of these things that are sort of going on, and all of that is carefully orchestrated to deliver an experience. So that's services. And then at the end here, you've got systems, you've got whole businesses or ecosystems or startups. And this is really where design thinking kind of comes in this circle here. And this is where design thinking is usually most valuable. So I've talked enough about design in terms of what it is. So why now? And why should we be talking about design during the coronavirus in this time of change? And a really good report to dig in on, if anyone's interested, is this piece of work that was carried out by InVision. So anyone on the call who's maybe been involved in a startup or in new product development might have come across InVision. InVision is a software application, software tool for basically, creating kind of digital prototypes. It's a digital prototyping tool, and it's sort of in a cluster of tools like Figma, Marvel, Adobe XD, and they've sort of taken their approach, I guess, to kind of marketing has been very sort of content led, and they've got an amazing team of researchers and product leaders who invest incredible time developing this wonderful content about design practice and methods. So last year they put together this wonderful report. It's been the largest design study of its kind ever produced, because they spoke to well over 2,000 different companies. So highly qualitative, but really immersive interviews with companies and company representatives across 24 different industries and in 77 countries. So nothing quite like this has ever been done before, where you've got an organization that are really probing how design as a practice shows up in all these different sectors, in all these different types of companies all across the world. And a sort of a extraction of findings and analysis of how design is being used, how it's understood. We just sort of talked about, defining what design is, and is it, about designing a logo or a website, or is it kind of much more broader than that? And this is quite pervasive, and so this study was really, really interesting, and the findings even more interesting. So if we go we dig in on the study, essentially what InVision came up with is these 5 levels of design maturity, and they're really kind of saying, as you sort of analyze these 2,500 companies, you see these 5 buckets really, and you can line them all up in a row, and you can sort of maybe understand these groups as a chronology or as a kind of a stepping stone. So at the bottom you have this kind of low level of maturity, perhaps level 1, where they find that this group of companies use design in a very sort of production oriented way. Okay, so they view that design is what happens on screens, and as you move up, people using design in a sort of as a way to connect broader teams and communities. Design is a sort of something that can be codified, level 3, and deployed in a repeated way. So they call these guys architects. Moving up again, where design is showing up in innovation teams, and design is being deployed to create new products and services. So these are the scientists who are very goal-oriented, who are very hypothesis-driven. And then at the very top, you had about sort of 5 to 7% of all these companies examined, who InVision described as visionaries. So these are the organizations that are using design as business strategy. So they're applying design method and design thinking to actually, crystallize the direction they're headed and deploy design thinking into the operations of the business. And of course, the example that everybody like me uses in presentations like this is Apple, because Apple are very much the epitome of that. But there are lots and lots of other examples, and actually this isn't new. Going back to 1970s, this is Tom Watson, who was the then Tom Watson Jr., company founded by his father. Tom Watson was the man who sort of put IBM very much on the map, and always talked about this platitude that's really famous: good design is good business. And what he was talking about there was actually design in this role of adding value as a way of making, delivering distinctive experience for customers, as a way to differentiate product offerings, as a way to really think through the entire process of design, manufacture, distribution, merchandise, communications. And Apple, as again, this kind of perennial example, and let's bring it back to the coronavirus for a second. I was recently in the Apple store in Belfast, and just really struck with how typically brilliant Apple's response, the Apple retail store's response is to coronavirus, to social distancing, to some of these kind of measures that have been put in place. And I spoke to one of the team there, and they said, I think the Apple retail model is really well set up for social distancing. And so they've done some things like introducing this concierge service. They're introducing temperature checks and a sanitization pod within the in-store environment. But they don't just do this randomly. Apple have to understand the challenge and define this kind of problem and a set of parameters. They set out to design this scalable system, so they have a system that's replicable and can be understood and adopted and deployed consistently across thousands of stores globally. The concierge is using an application that is allowing them to kind of check in and send new customers to a specific member of staff within. In order to do this, then you really need to understand the user journey. You need to understand the footprint and the flow of individual customers through the store. And then you also need to know, how they can design every single interaction. So when that's a physical interaction, that's about a kind of scripts and dialogue and how to deal with kind of, customers who are frustrated. And you also need to kind of understand then what role technology plays in all of that. So none of this is by accident. It's absolutely by design. And I'd encourage anyone who is in the business, is a sort of a physical kind of business, be that retail or hospitality, to have a wander down to the Apple store and take some notes.